In the beginning, I remember that, in order to do embalming, we generally had to do it in a hospital. So if we had somebody, for argument's sake, who passed away in a hospital in Dublin, we would leave here very early in the morning, head for Dublin. I had 2 flight cases which contained most of my embalming equipment. We would arrive in the hospital usually around 8 or half 8, and I would carry out the embalming in the hospital. We'd then dress the person and put them in a coffin. And the family would generally come in around 12 o'clock and maybe view for an hour or an hour and a half. And then we would close the coffin and head back to the church wherever we were going. And the burial would be the next day, because funerals were generally very quick back then. So even though the family only viewed for a short space of time, I personally thought that the embalming was a worthwhile process, that it was an advantage to them to view the deceased laid out, looking in a natural repose as possible. And I believed in it, and so I didn't mind putting in those long hours to promote embalming. And I wasn't the only one. There was a few funeral homes in the country who did the same. A lot of times we had to go to different funeral homes to carry out the embalming process. And generally speaking, we were only called in if something went wrong. And therefore the embalming we had to do sometimes was quite tough. Maybe the person had passed away a few days before that, and they waited for a length of time until something went wrong, and then of course called us. And we had to go in and try and reverse the process, which at then was quite tough, and we often found it very hard, but it was probably good training. It made us able to cater for situations that we mightn't have otherwise been able to cater for. And of course, if an instance like this kind of happened when I was carrying out my own funeral business, then of course I knew how to handle it, because I had this practice of doing it in different funeral homes around the country. And the funeral homes, of course, would always tell us that they had all the facilities necessary for us to carry out an embalming process. And I remember very early on arriving in one funeral home, and they had the person on 2 trusses, which are normally used to support a coffin. And on top of the 2 trusses, they had a door, and on top of the door, they had the person. And that's where I had to carry out my embalming procedure. Again, something tough to do, but I think it advanced myself in my own training and my own ability to handle different scenarios. We also often had to do it in a house, in a bed, which I often found the toughest part of doing that, even though it was hard and it took a lot of concentration. But I always found afterwards the hardest part was actually the fact that you were bent over so low that your back afterwards was always very sore. Of course, when you're working in your embalming room, you have your embalming table, which is up at a proper height, and you're working at a level basis. And I remember another time I was in a funeral home, and the funeral director had told me that the family would be up during the afternoon and they had clothes for the deceased. So they arrived on with a pants and a shirt and tie and the usual clothes, but they had a blazer which was in a dry cleaning bag, and it had all the dry cleaning labels on it. So whether it's my drapery training or what, I don't know, but always when I'm putting clothes on someone, I'm always inclined to search the pockets to see, just in case there's something of value in those pockets to a family. And oftentimes you'll come across maybe a brochure for a wedding, or you'll come across maybe a rosary beads that they didn't know they'd lost, or something that's very personal to them. But this man came in and he handed me a blazer, but the blazer, I said, was in a dry cleaning bag, so I presumed that there would be nothing in the pockets, but still I decided to search them. And I remember at the time I found 2,500 in the inside pocket. And I remember ringing the funeral director and saying to him, that I had found this money in the inside pocket. And of course he said he would mind it and take care of it and pass it back to the family. And the family did contact me afterwards and thank me for finding it, because if I hadn't searched the pockets, they never would have missed it, and it would have just gone down in the ground with the man. So they were grateful. And there's a few instances that something like that happened where I found money in pockets, and it's just a complete habit I have of actually searching the pockets. I remember another time I performed an embalming in a hospital, but the funeral home was nearby, so I offered to bring the person back to the funeral home. So I brought him back to the funeral home, and myself and the funeral director dressed the person and put them in a coffin. And while we were putting the coffin in the funeral home, I noticed that he had a little CD player or a radio in the corner, and I asked him, what is that for, or why is that there? So he told me that he plays music in the background during the reposing. And this was before I built my own funeral home. And I remember saying to myself, God, that's a lovely idea. And because I went and did the embalming that day, I came up with this idea. And when I came home and when I went to build my own funeral home, I put in a sound system and the whole facility so as I could play music in the background, something that we do to this day and something that I think is nice and appropriate. But because I was on the road embalming and looking at different funeral homes, and that's how I came up with that idea. I say back then, generally speaking, the embalming was carried out in hospitals, so I had my little kit that I used to take from hospital to hospital. When I built the funeral home first, we used to have to travel quite a bit to do embalming. And I had no objection to it at the time because I suppose funds were a little low and everything helped to keep the show on the road. So I had no issue travelling, doing embalming and travelling to different both funeral homes and hospitals. And of course, over the years, the funeral home facilities improved big time. They all more or less started to put in a proper embalming facility into their funeral homes. And of course, the hospitals eventually then decided that they didn't want any more embalming being carried out in the hospital. So therefore, we had to do the embalming in the funeral homes. So our own funeral business, we used to do what we'd call a trade embalming, then embalming for other funeral homes that would bring remains into us, and we would embalm them for them. So again, we didn't have to go to the hospital to do this anymore. Now we found that they were all brought here, so our work was completely here. We're now working in the funeral home all the time, which was a huge advantage and cut out all this travelling. I never minded the travelling in the beginning, but I suppose as years clicked by, the travelling kind of became a bit of an issue, and I suppose you were just tired after a day if you were out on the road when you came home in the evening, whereas if you were able to carry out your embalming process here in the funeral home, it made it a lot easier. Thanks for listening.